Last time we chatted about Caroline getting wise about voodoo legends in this place from Mrs. Devon, and today we're gonna dive deeper. Then Caroline swung by the Wizardry Laundry on the pretense of shopping in the city, threw a dozen washing machines into the back alley. There are a bunch of odd objects on the shelf, and the aura of the otherworldly comes. A black woman is mixing potions for a girl. Use my recipe to make sure your man won't bash you again. Seems that hoodoo witchcraft can also handle domestic abuse too. Caroline made it short and sweet. What if someone gets poisoned? The big sis got the scoop and grabbed a bunch of things from the shelf. This can ward off bad vibes. Caroline was skeptical. She still felt that the so-called exorcism was just a placebo. Back to the house. Caroline immediately hit the room to prepare for the casting. Set up the stuff according to the instructions of the goddess. You don't have to do anything. Just gotta believe. Then watch Caroline work up and down with tears in his eyes. According to the goddess's instructions, the ritual of chanting reflects. A paralyzed patient miraculously speaks. What the hell? As soon as Ben opened his mouth to speak, he kept begging Caroline to save him. Caroline is asking why Ben asked for help. Mrs. Devon suddenly called out to Caroline from outside and asked Caroline to open the door. Mrs. Diva was livid and told Caroline to head back to her room. Ever since, the girl got sick, tossing and turning in bed at night. The strange stuff I saw in the attic kept haunting me. It's just past 1 a.m. Caroline grabbed a mirror and looked at it, only to catch a black figure outside the door. How can anyone stand this? What crappy place to pack up and retreat quickly. Caroline was about to take off in the morning when she noticed Ben's despair and hopelessness in the courtyard. Looking at her pop's picture again, Caroline decided to investigate. She took her camera to the attic and snapped pictures of various dolls, spells books, and records. Get the photo and head to lawyer Luke. What's brewing with his family? Luke refused to budge. It's like this in the great southern United States. Are you a nurse or a private eye? Caroline now suspects that Mrs. DeVore paralyzed Ben to snatch the family fortune. Why else would you rewrite your will? There used to be several caregivers in the house. Caroline offered to chat with her ex. Luke led the way to a certain hospital to find a black nurse named Haley. Asked Caroline if she is a believer. Haley was still spooked about that house. Mrs. DeVoe must have cast some kind of spell on the old guy. They passed that small grocery store on the way back. Caroline asked Luke to pull over and showed him the red brick powder mark at the doorstep. Everyone here is into witchcraft. Even if it was fake, it really messed with Ben's body and mind. Caroline suddenly caught the sound of the sacrifice record and followed the music into the room. Strangely, Luke held back at the door. The room is still the old blind mother-in-law, with lots of energy. That the black Jaspy had learned a strong spell to extend life. Somebody has to be sacrificed in the process. It's just that before the success, he flipped out and his wife Cicely both kicked the bucket. Magic has been lost since then. Once Caroline heard about it, it was probably Mrs. Devon planning to sacrifice her husband. Luke promised to go to court tomorrow to apply for a search warrant. But the girl can't wait to go back to the house and gather evidence directly. Mrs. DeVore is trimming her husband's hair and opens the grimoire in the kitchen and rips off one of them. Caroline figured out that the sacrificial record originally in the suitcase is gone. Looks like Mrs. DeVour has got herself a clue. Just to be safe, Caroline trekked to the tool shed to get some red brick powder and splashed it on the door. Caroline decided to bust Ben tonight. Here's the plan. Dump the ecstasy into the candy bar and mix it into the teacup at dinner. But the old lady was pretty sharp and got the sugar jar. Caroline just dumped the potion straight down. Mrs. DeVoe actually mixed the stuff into the soup. Mrs. Devon elegantly drank the poisoned wine and passed out. The paper Mrs. DeVore pulled from the grimoire was probably some lucky charm. Caroline saw the word, protection, written on it. The bad guy's obsession is 80% good. Then shoved Ben to run away immediately. But the iron door is sticky, and the road is slippery in the rain. Mrs. DeVoe came round and got her gun. Caroline had to stash Ben in the tool shed for the time being, while she paddled off. She's been watching this route for ages. After a paddle, I saw someone camping on the shore. Caroline bummed a ride to Luke's place. Like, why not go home to your best bud Jill? I think it's easier to keep Mrs. DeVore in check if a guy is tougher. Luke watched Caroline come in freaking out. While we were talking, Mrs. DeVoe rang up. Luke said nicely, hang on, and switch on the tape recorder at the same time. Caroline went around while he was on the phone. The room is neat with traditional Southern street music playing on the record player. On the desk are some basic legal books. Caroline couldn't help but feel a bit creepy. Why you still read the elementary textbook after you got the lawyer qualification certificate? But what's even crazier is under the book. Turns out that I've been prey for ages. Just as Caroline was in shock, Luke attacked her from behind and knocked her unconscious into the car. After being covered, Luke drove Caroline back to the villa. Life's full of surprises, ain't it? Caroline then figured out that the one who got sacrificed was her own self. Mrs. DeVoe bullied her to spill the beans about Ben. The old guy is in the tool shed with big scissors planning a surprise attack. But weakly paralyzed for too long, insufficient combat strength was countered. Caroline took the chance to escape and dodged the two hanging around the house. Mrs. DeVoe grabbed Caroline's neck at the right moment. After all, the age gap is a bunch of years. Fell off the guardrail in a brawl, old limbs. Luke was livid when he saw this. I want you buried with me. Caroline didn't just focus on the crisis at hand. Cats in the house. Call 911. After calling the address, Caroline called her best friend Jill, and then the phone was cut off. At this point, Mrs. DeVore used the elevator to get to the second floor. Knocking on the door is like pushing Caroline to race into the attic. There's a candle altar here. Pull out the remnants of the grimoire. Since the word shelter's written on it, it might be a barrier. So Caroline followed suit and gathered the needed stuff. Then draw a circle as instructed and shear off a chunk of hair. Cut the palm and stamp around. Everything's set. Mrs. DeVoe barged in. Chill out, kid. Caroline has the altar to stay strong. Mrs. DeVoe scoffed. The castle turned out to be a trap. Everything's to make Caroline believe in witchcraft. The candles go out in unison, and the altar looks like a graveyard. After a long while, Caroline woke up from the ground. Mrs. DeVoe awoke too, then calmly pulled out a cigarette from the cigarette case and lit it. And Caroline doesn't smoke. The director threw in over 90 minutes of smoke bombs and finally exposed the cards. Now you can carry on. The black servants Jaspi and Cicely never truly kicked the bucket. The longevity magic mentioned by the blind mother-in-law worked out. On the day of the latter 90 years ago, they swapped their souls for a pair of banker sons and daughters. So it was the kid who was burned alive. The real deal of sacrifice is swapping souls. Jaspi and Cicely have been brothers and sisters for decades. By the 1960s, holding onto the Devers' bodies to sell the house and live again for decades. When those two bodies were about to crumble, they targeted Caroline, the total screw-up. From actor to killer, to achieve immortality needs all-around skills. It ain't easy. Jaspi had previously nailed convincing lawyer Luke. This is Luke's real self. The hardest part of the swap is getting Caroline to buy into witchcraft or not. All the past deeds of the two, including the door that wouldn't open in the attic. The mirror shows off the figure, the door sprinkles red brick powder, etc., are all fake vibes. Luke should be pushing the door in the attic. The figure is Mrs. DeVore. What makes this flick unique is that besides the final big move, not too many spooky supernatural stuff. The next morning, Caroline's best mate Jill rolled up. When Jill stepped into the room, she saw Mrs. Devon on the stretcher. Body and tongue can't move. Fake Caroline was naturally clueless about their ties. But it's not rocket science to fool the past. The ending is super subtle. Caroline wrapped her arms around Jill, and then hoped that she could join the Devers to the hospital. Luke seemed to take the bull by the horns to chat to Jill. There's real love in the world. This house has changed hands now. Caroline is really vital to the Devers. Even though the time spent together is nothing but, they really loved her. They gave the house to Caroline. This scene might be hinting. Cicely has a crush on Jill's body. She has the potential to be the next believer. Two old dudes in their 20s and 30s locked eyes in the ambulance. It's like two lowlifes chatting about the answer. I didn't expect retirement to come fast. Even if they get their voice and mobility back, they'll probably be labeled as loonies. Caroline stuck back to the house and whipped on the three-headed snake ring symbolizing magic. Jaspi and Cicely in the snap are super proud of their outstanding performance. The camera slowly zooms up. This country house has been around nearly 100 years. From the look to the owner hasn't changed. The director has slipped in soul swap more than once. The tricky storyline can only be fully grabbed by looking back. Why would a banker whack his wife 90 years ago, and then off himself? It just says, mental breakdown? It's probably Jaspi and Cicely telling the truth after. They burned their children, and the bankers who learned the truth couldn't take it and went mad. Mrs. DeVoe thought Caroline was white when she first bumped into her. This is clearly picking on the body about to be taken over. Caroline's eyes and mouth were sealed in the nightmare. I can't tell you the bitter punchline corresponding to the end of the film. Whether Caroline is nosy or love is limitless, everyone has a different take. Alright, that wraps up today's movie chat. Hope you can back me a ton. Here's Roger Says Flick. Catch you later.